Okay, I think we'll get started. Thank you all for being here, and welcome to our NEON colleagues. For the EOL side of the audience, this is the sort of start of a conversation between NCAR and NEON that will continue with some workshops next year, but we're very happy to have them here visiting EOL. So our presenters today are Sharon Collinge, who is an ecologist and the chief scientist and director of the observatory for NEON. And she has with her four other colleagues. I don't have time to do full introductions. They promised they would introduce themselves. But it's Kate Thibault, who's a vertebrate ecologist and heads up the small mammal and avian components of the observatory. Mike SanClements, who's co-chairing with Goulden, who's also in the audience, this NCAR NEON working group. And he's a biogeochemist and heads up the terrestrial instrument science, biogeochemistry, and soil science. Tristan Goulden is an associate scientist with expertise in airborne LiDAR measurements, and he's here representing the Airborne platform. And Christine Laney is an ecoinformaticist, and she has an environmental sciences background but heads up the data science component. So welcome, and looking forward to your presentation. Do you want the microphone or the...
I'm going to be quick.
Okay. Yep.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. My name is Sharon Collinge, and as Britt said, I'm the Chief Scientist and Observatory Director. A relatively new position for me. I've been in this role full-time just since June 1st, part-time since the end of February, so coming up on 8 or 9 months. I have been a faculty member at the University of Colorado here in Boulder for the last 20 years in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department and the Environmental Studies program. So I'm currently on a 2-year appointment to NEON. And I just want to say I'm thrilled that you're here, and I'm really happy to be able to present this star-studded cast who is going to tell you about NEON and a little bit of the history and where we are now. The goal here is really to increase awareness and enable the research community to use the NEON data and infrastructure. And so we're really excited to be here and let you know where things stand right now. So I'll turn it over to Kate.
Thanks, Sharon. All right, I think I can turn this off and just stand at the podium. So hello, everyone. As you heard 3 times now, I'm Kate Thibault. I started at NEON back in 2011. My dissertation and postdoctoral work was in community ecology and macroecology, so both long temporal scales and large spatial scale analyses. So NEON was a good fit for me. I was started there in 2011 as the vertebrate ecologist. I then became one of the leads of the terrestrial observation system. So this is not the sensors, but the humans out in the environment collecting data that we'll talk a little bit about. And now I help oversee all of the NEON science. So as Sharon said, we're here to tell you more about the science that NEON is designed to enable. So I and then Mike and Tristan will go over some of the basics of what NEON is doing. And then Christine will show you how to access the data. So there's a couple of different tools out there, and so she'll give you a tour of that. All right, so NEON is sort of unique in the ecological realm. It's the first major research infrastructure in ecology and out of the Biogeochemistry of NSF. It provides a coordinated national system that monitors both the drivers of environmental change as well as the biological responses to that change. So we're attempting to sample the variability and trends in such a way to allow inference at regional and continental scales. NEON offers a variety of things to the scientific community and beyond. First and foremost, we deliver data. So all of the data that we collect is free and open and high quality on as I said, the drivers and responses to ecological change. Much of it has been designed with interoperability with other network science efforts in mind. We also just provide a framework to allow for supplementary research to complement what NEON is doing. And this includes some assets that we'll touch on that are available to the community, which is very similar to the EOL model. While we're doing all of our sampling, we are collecting samples and specimens to archive in a museum to serve as a long-term resource for, again, additional PI-driven research. We do run some educational programs, primarily focused on equipping ecologists with the data science skills to work with large data sets like NEON, and probably a lot of the skills that most of you folks have, but a lot of our ecological colleagues do not. And then finally, our field and data science staff are also available to support PI-driven research. So in terms of the assets that we have that are available on a cost recoverable basis to use, we have 3 airborne observation platforms. They're used for NEON sampling, but also available for other projects that PIs can apply for funding to get and run campaigns with our payloads. We have mobile deployment platforms, which Mike will talk a little bit more about. Those are essentially our mobile flux towers. And then, of course, we have our towers at all of our sites that are available for folks to put additional sensors or instruments on that infrastructure. And then, of course, at each of our sites where we are operating, we have staff that can provide support for other researchers. So we have 81 field sites throughout the United States, and including Puerto Rico, Alaska, and Hawaii. 47 of those are terrestrial, and 34 are aquatic. And our aquatic sites are mostly streams, but we do have some lakes and rivers as well. All of the sampling that happens at these 81 sites ultimately generate 177 data products that are delivered through our data portal that Christine will show you. The data products span a multitude of themes. So we have atmospheric and organismal ecology, ecohydrology, biogeochemistry, and remote sensing. So it's a diverse array of data types. We use 3 different methods generally to collect data. So our observational sampling that I mentioned earlier, our automated instruments, and then our airborne remote sensing. And the design of NEON is to have all of these systems operating in the same places so that the data generated by these different methods can be integrated. And we've done that as much as possible, and we use standardized methods across all of our sites to allow for comparability wherever possible. So you can see that in these idealized schematics of our terrestrial and aquatic sites. This gives you an idea of the co-location of our towers with all of the other observational sampling happening at a site, and then ideally the aquatic site is also there as well. So I'll just give a brief overview of the observational sampling. So this includes what we call sentinel taxa, so they're thought to be sentinels of environmental change. The taxa that we've chosen, biogeochemical data, and then of course some geomorphology, lake bathymetry, and hydrology measurements. So the sentinel taxa, again, they're like the canary in the coal mine. They're generally widespread, abundant, and known to respond to environmental change. And so these taxa were selected many years ago by the Tiger teams, of which some of you were members of those. Probably not this particular one, so that's where the selection comes from. So in the terrestrial side, we are sampling plants and soil microbes, small mammals, mosquitoes, birds, ground beetles, ticks, and then soil biogeochemical measurements. We're interested in addition to standard community ecology metrics of diversity and abundance, we're interested in phenology, of course, as well as productivity, and then pathogens in the case of small mammals, mosquitoes, and ticks. For the aquatic sites, we're sampling fish, macroinvertebrates, microbes, again, algae, aquatic plants, and then the chemistry of sediment and water at those sites. We do have some great examples already of people using our data. So obviously we want to see more of this. This is a researcher from Duke University, Jim Clark, who's used some of our organismal data in an ecological forecasting framework to try to predict the diversity of communities in response to climate change. With that, oh no, the sample repository, right. So a little bit more information about this. We collect over 70,000 bits and pieces of soil and animals and plants and other critters every year, and these are being archived. Our repository is at Arizona State University, so this is just getting up and running, but it will have, there's the long list of sample types there. I think some of the things you might be interested in are the ambient and frozen soils, as well as the dust filters that are complementary to the National Atmospheric Deposition Program filter repository. So a diversity of those items are available for use by the community. Okay, with that, I will hand it over to Mike.
Hello, so I'm Mike SanClements. I've been at NEON since 2012 after doing a postdoc at CU with Diane McKnight. And by training, I'm a soil scientist, soil chemist, but I lead the terrestrial instrumented system, so that includes the ecovariance towers and all of the soil instruments as well. And so I just want to give you a really high overview of our terrestrial instrument systems today. And I'm also going to talk quickly about the aquatic instrument systems as well. So this is just an example of one of our sites. So the D1 Harvard Forest site, and like I said, the tower includes the tower, all the instrumentation on that tower, as well as the soil sensors. And so then just to show you kind of what our aquatic sites look like, we have 34 of these, and again, we just have a number of lakes and streams that are fully instrumented. In streams and lakes, we have two sampling systems, so usually an inlet and outlet to the lake, as well as a breach of the stream system. And we'll get into a little more detail on what these are. But looking at our tower heights, we have 47 sites ranging from 7.9 meters up to 85 meters at Wind River. So we have quite a bit different range and ecosystem stature with towers throughout those. You can see most are favoring this 7.9 meter height. So that includes grasslands as well as the Arctic tundra. And then our tallest tower is out at the Wind River Experimental Forest. And that's a kind of a unique tower in a way because we instrumented the Forest Service tower that they had for decades up there rather than creating a new tower in that 500-year-old growth forest. So if you haven't been to any on site, here's just sort of a display of what they actually look like. You can see the instrument hut over here. That's where the instruments are, the tower. And then we have the double fence rain gauge over here. And then we have this soil array. And at each one of our sites, we have 5 soil array plots. And at each one of those, we're measuring different things like temperature and moisture. I'll talk more about that in a second. And those are distributed typically across about 150 meters across the site and always within the footprint of the tower so that we can start to nest our soil fluxes in the tower footprint. And so our soil temperature and moisture measurements lie in there. And this is the Niwot Ridge site if you haven't been up there. So for the tower data products, we have a pretty standard suite of measurements. This is the Ordway-Swisher Biological Station tower, so in Florida. We have profiles of things like air temperature and humidity, as well as barometric pressure, precipitation on the tower top, then a suite of radiation, and then we have our things like the ecosystem exchange and our concentration profiles of CO2 and H2O, as well as isotopes. And then we have wet deposition collections at each of our sites, which are located on top of the tower. And then a number of our sites, we collect dust and particulate size distribution of mass, especially in Colorado, and where dust is really relevant in the mountains. And then we have a phenocam at each one of our sites as well. Right now, we're in some kind of exciting conversations with NADP that we've just kicked off to sort of start thinking about integrating our wet depth collections into their system and doing some methodological papers to see if we get the same results as them across sites. So that's pretty exciting to think about. So this is just kind of an overview, and we could ask more questions about these after the talk. One thing that I think is really exciting, not just because I'm a soil scientist, but it provides a lot of opportunity for the community is when we start each of our sites, we start with this thing we call the TIS megapit, and we dig one huge soil pit to about 2 meters at depth, and then we work with the NRCS to describe that soil profile. And then we take these giant boxes that you can see that are carved out here and intact, and we send those off to Woods Hole. And that's what we use to calibrate all of our soil moisture and sensors, as well as get diffusivity measurements for our in-ground flux measurements. So we can calculate that based on the actual diffusivity of the soil rather than just a model. So that's pretty exciting. And then we also, at each one of these places, we collect 3.2 kilograms per horizon of soil, which we feed into our soil archive, and that is available for anyone to request for their own research. And as for the instrumentation in the soil plots, at each one of our 5 soil plots, we have a bunch of measurements that we make on the soils from that big megapit archive. We do soil physical properties, so things like texture. Then we do a basic suite of chemical properties, so that's things like cations and anions and pH. We do what the NRCS basically does for their characterization. And then once we have our calibration coefficients and everything, we install all of our soil sensors. We do our soil temperature, and we do our soil water and salinity to 2 meters at each soil plot, unless it's in permafrost, and then we go to 3 meters. So most of our sites are to 2 meters. And then we have our soil CO2 concentrations in here, which we calculate into a flux based on that diffusivity. And we're working on an R package over the next year that will take all that diffusivity data we've collected from Woods Hole and be able to couple with our sensors to generate the flux. Right now we're just putting out concentration, but we'll have fluxes in the future. And then we have a heat flux plate as well in here, as through-fall collectors and line quantum sensors and net radiometers. So that's sort of what our soil plots each collect. And those are, like I said, distributed in the footprint of the air shed. For AIS, we do a similar suite of meteorological measurements using the same sensors at each one of the sites. So next to each stream, we have a tripod with things like the upward and downward radiation, as well as 2D wind measurements and temperature. So sort of mimicking a minor suite of what we have on our towers. And then we do a number of different water chemistry sampling bouts throughout the stream over the year, as well as water chemistry sampling with sensors. And then we have groundwater wells. And we also do a whole riparian vegetation assessment around that area, as well as re-aeration sampling. And we can talk more about specific measurements that we make in the streams if anyone has any questions. And then we have a few lakes at our sites, and for that, like I said, we have an inlet and an outlet to the lake, as well as a buoy where we mount all of our sensors on there for things like dissolved oxygen and pH and nitrogen, etc. And then, once again, at all of our lakes, we would have our groundwater wells distributed there for chemical measurements, etc. So that's kind of our layout for those. You can kind of run down here and see what I was talking about as far as these measurements. Part at water surface, part below the water surface, the elevation of the water, so that's a pressure transducer measurement, and then water temperature, and then a bunch of things like dissolved oxygen, pH, turbidity, and then we have FDOM as well in all of our systems, and nitrate. So that's sort of the rundown of what we measure at those aquatic instrumentation systems. We have about 16 sites that are co-located, so we have a nice flow from the tower right down into the AIS sites, so that's pretty good. We've been working a lot lately on data interoperability, and I mentioned that a little bit with the NADP. And so right now, one of the big things we've been working on my team is trying to get all of our sites registered as Ameriflux network sites. So that's something we've been working on last year and have been making good progress on, and that's going to all feed up to the Fluxwork network. So it's been really exciting to sort of get that synergy going rather than be two separate organizations not really thinking, but delivering our data together as well. And we're also doing the same thing with all of our PhenoCam network images. We're sending that data to the PhenoCam network, and they're processing it, putting it on their site, and it's living on our site. So trying to reach out and wherever we can make these synergies happen. And this is just a list of some of our co-located Ameriflux Neon sites. And we've been recently talking with Ameriflux quite a bit about moving forward and sort of looking at validating our sites based on their data at some of these co-located sites. So I see a lot of power here in making sure our data is great and working together to sort of make new understanding across these sites. And finally, this is something that's really neat. This is an R package that a couple of people at Neon put together. Josh Roberti is one of them. And it's called MetScanner. And what Josh has made basically is this R package where you can put in any location. It could be a Neon site, it could not. And you can put in a radius, and it will tell you every network that exists within that and what data products they have and the number of them within that radius around a Neon site or around one of any NCAR site. So that's a really powerful tool. You can plot in a geolocation and see how many other sensing stations there are. So, within whatever this site was, within 10 kilometers, there might be 200 Mesonet stations or whatever the values are. So this is really exciting moving forward. And I think when we think about this NCAR Neon workshop, this tool might be really powerful as we start looking at where you might have sensors and we might have sensors and what's in between and all the other things we can bring in. We talked briefly about the mobile deployment platforms, and so these are very similar to the EOL systems. It's 5 self-contained, basically neon sites. They're a little bit pared down, but essentially they're the same. We're just using a Roan tower, and we're using the same instrument hut. It's just mounted on a trailer, and so these systems can be either powered with line power or they have their own generator systems, so we can basically distribute this anywhere. We were really shooting for rapid deployment capability with these, and that's why we have this trailer instrument hut. And like I said, there's 5 of them. And so we have the full suite of tower instruments, so the same systems for eddy covariance, et cetera. And then we have a soil instrument array. The soil instrument array is where this differs from our neon sites, and that's because we can't go out and make diffusivity measurements and do all these calibrations in the same way we would at our full sites. So we're relying on things like light core flux chambers here, and then using a CLIMA temperature moisture sensors rather than the Sentex that require a lot of calibration. And then we also have a set of aquatic sensors that can go with this too. So you can set up a mini co-located neon, basically aquatic AIS site or TIS site. And one other thing that came up earlier today is a few of us, myself, Tristan, and a couple other scientists at NEON have got a small grant where we purchased several drones and have been working to integrate drones into our NEON program. The initial thought was that with our airborne systems, and Tristan will talk a lot more about this, we're shooting for peak greenness at all these sites across the year, and that's very difficult to capture all those. And so if we can integrate drones and start to correlate some of our data products, the airborne data products, there may be the potential to increase our temporal and spatial, basically, data set every year. And so that's something we've been working on a lot over the last year. And we've done now, 2 flights in tandem with the airborne, one to just over calibration tarps out at Table Mountain, and then Harvard Forest as well. So we're going to start working on some of those correlations, which is pretty exciting. And that's pretty much it for TIS.
All right. So my name's Tristan Goulden, a scientist in the Airborne Remote Sensing Group. I originally came down here from Canada. I started at NEON in 2014. My PhD, I worked on improving watershed scale hydrological models with high resolution topography derived from LiDAR data. So overall, overview of the Airborne Observation Platform. We're collecting airborne remote sensing data. Generally, we're covering regional scales at each one of the NEON sites. So normally we fly a minimum of 100 kilometers squared at each site. We'll collect normally about 75% of the NEON sites annually. And then we produce data products at high resolution, which range from 10 centimeters squared to 1 centimeter squared. And the sensors we have on our airborne platform is a waveform LiDAR, imaging spectrometer, and high-resolution digital camera. So broadly, the Airborne Observation Platform team is divided into 3 main groups. We have the flight operations team, and they take care of the annual observation and collection of the data at all of the NEON sites. So they'll oversee the installation of the equipment into the aircraft and then do the data collections. We have a payload development and sensor calibration team. They really deal with the calibration and maintenance of the sensors, as well as the electrical and mechanical support infrastructure of the sensors in the aircraft. And then a data processing and algorithm development team. So currently we're working on the routine data processing of the data that we're collecting in operations. We also develop those algorithms and are continuing to enhance those algorithms, as well as providing data QA/QC throughout the flight season. So the image on the bottom corner there is our payload as it sits inside the aircraft. The instrument in the kind of copper cylinder you see on the left is the imaging spectrometer. That was custom built for us by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. It's part of NASA. Then we have the waveform LiDAR, which you can kind of see peeking out on the bottom right-hand side. It's the green box. Our LiDARs are commercial LiDARs from either Optech or Regal, and then we have a digital camera that comes along with those LiDAR systems. So we've integrated all these sensors into a custom payload and designed the support infrastructure as well as health monitoring equipment of these sensors that we use to monitor them throughout the flight season. So just a brief overview of the sensors. The imaging spectrometer, essentially what it collects is raw digital numbers of the incident solar radiation. We convert that to a at sensor radiance and then convert that to a reflectance, which is the amount of reflected energy off the landscape from the incident solar radiation. The spectrometer operates in a push broom configuration, so essentially it collects one single line of pixels at a time, and it does that at about 100 hertz. Each one of those pixels, though, has several spectral bands associated with it. We collect in the wavelength region of 380 nanometers up to 2510, and we separate that into 5 nanometer bands, of which each of those bands have a full width half max of less than 7.5 nanometers. So as the aircraft is moving forward, typically at about 50 meters per second, we're collecting a line of pixels about every half meter. The instantaneous field of view of the instrument is 1 milliradian, and we typically fly at about 1,000 meters, so that allows us to get 1 meter samples on the landscape. So the bottom right-hand image shows a typical reflectance curve from vegetation. We have a waveform LiDAR sensor. As I mentioned, these come from commercial vendors. It's an active remote sensing instrument, so it generates its own laser pulse. It operates at 1064 nanometers, which reflects really well from vegetation. This system also comes with the high-quality GPS and IMU system to enable us to give us really good accuracy on our airborne trajectory, sort of where the plane is and how it's sitting in the air as we're collecting the observations. And the airborne LiDAR allows us to collect structural information of the objects on the landscape. And then we have high-resolution digital camera. So this is just a typical RGB camera system at our altitude. Normally we can get a spatial resolution of 5 to 10 centimeters. So why are we using hyperspectral and LiDAR to study ecosystems? It's because these two data streams are really synergistic, giving us different data streams of information about the different landscapes. And we're particularly interested in vegetation. So you can see in the top image, there's a point cloud derived from the LiDAR that gives that really rich structural information on the vegetation. And then the bottom, you can see reflectance curves from that vegetation, which we can make inferences on vegetation type as well as vegetation health. So you can see on the far right-hand side, there's two reflectance curves. The top one comes from one tree and the bottom one from a different one, and you can see that there's something different happening with these two trees based on the difference in those two reflectance curves. One's a lot lower than the other one. So for our flight operations, we use a twin-otter aircraft. We chose this aircraft because its ability to fly really low and slow, and because it had a payload capacity to carry the weight of our instruments. Typically, there's 2 pilots that fly with the aircraft, and we lease these aircrafts from Twin Otter International, which is a company in Grand Junction. So they provide the aircraft, the pilots, and do the maintenance. We're really responsible for providing the personnel to run the equipment, as well as help out with the installation of the equipment. So, as I mentioned, we typically fly at about 1,000 meters AGL. This is driven by a requirement to collect data that allows us to see individual vegetation. We fly regional scales, 10 by 10 kilometer boxes, in order to capture at a regional scale that covers all the other activities that are happening at the NEON sites, the instrumented and observational sampling. And then we also typically fly at peak greenness. And so peak greenness is kind of the time when the vegetation is most photosynthetically active, and we fly at that time to control for changes in the phenological cycle. So we're trying to collect data over 30 years in the NEON Observatory. We want to monitor changes over that 30 years, but we don't want to see any changes due to just changes in the phenological cycle. We want to see always at the same time of year what's the vegetation doing. This is a typical flight box design. So this is at Harvard Forest. It's one of our D1 sites. And so you can see the red dot shows the tower. So we will never fly or design our box to have an edge closer than 2 kilometers from the tower. And then the sort of yellow semicircle with the hatched lines is the predominant airshed of the tower, which we'll always make sure we cover. And then you can see the white boundary with kind of the dark green inside of it is the TOS boundaries. So that's where the field sampling plots would exist. And so then we would put our flight box around all of these other activities and then drop the white lines down, which is our flight lines, which we typically design to have 30% overlap. And then basically, we just fly in a configuration that's like mowing the lawn. So we just do a north-south flight line, turn around, go south to north, turn around, go north to south until we cover the entire area. So some of the challenges that we run into, one of the primary ones is meeting peak greenness across the entire continent. As you can imagine, in this environment, a lot of the sites that we fly are reaching peak greenness around the same time. We have a limited number of payloads, so it's hard for us to then schedule when those payloads are going to visit each site to ensure we visit each site during its peak greenness period. Also, weather is a major challenge for us. The quality of the spectrometer data is highly dependent on cloud-free conditions at each one of these sites. And as you can imagine, achieving completely cloud-free days in a lot of areas is particularly challenging. One of our favorite examples is the Great Smoky Mountains. Called Great Smoky Mountains for a reason. And unfortunately, at the time that we like to fly peak greenness, the weather is also particularly bad. We also occasionally run into sensor failures. It's not uncommon mounting this equipment, sensitive equipment, into an aircraft. It's experiencing all kinds of difficult conditions, vibrations, and landings and takeoffs that every once in a while we'll experience some failures. So what have we flown so far? So we started out our flight campaigns for which we're delivering data in 2013, and back then we were really in experimental phase. We just flew those 2 domains, 17 and 10. And again, we don't cover those whole domains, just the sites that we have within those domains. And then in 2014, 1 and 3. In 2015, 8 and 7. And then in 2016 is when we really started exercising our operational capability, where we flew half of the NEON domains with one of our payloads. And then in 2017, we really expanded out. First year, we brought the second payload online, and we flew everything except for Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Yellowstone. And then in this year, we've flown everything but Hawaii, and then those domains you see just in the white. And this is going to be our typical mode of operation moving forward, where we fly 16 of the 20 domains per year. So we'll capture the domains on a schedule of 3 every 4 years. So from the remote sensing data collections, we develop a series of data products, which we separate into different levels. Level 1 is kind of that first, the closest data that we deliver to raw data. We actually convert the raw data that the sensors collect into a product that has physical units. Level 2 data is some derived product from the level 1. Those are all based on the spectrometer data, basically different indexes of bands within the reflectance curve of the spectrometer data. And then level 3 is the level 2 products that are mosaicked, as well as some additional LiDAR products that are mosaicked. So some pretty pictures of those data products. This is a discrete return point cloud from the LiDAR. See in the bottom right-hand corner, you can really get that idea of the rich information we're getting on the structure of the vegetation based on that point cloud. And then again, another L1 product, the reflectance curves from the imaging spectrometer. And again, I've shown reflectance curve from vegetation. Typically what we see from vegetation is, if you look at that bottom image on the right, kind of that very first bump you see on the red curve on the left, that's the visible portion of the spectrum that we're covering. So that first little peak is the green, around the green wavelengths. And then you see that big jump around 800 nanometers, and that's the near infrared edge, where typically vegetation, when it's actively photosynthesizing, reflects energy really well on that near infrared edge. And so that's something we're really trying to track with the spectrometer that gives us information about the health of the vegetation. And so then our L2 products, normally what we do is some ratio or combination of bands so instead of having to look at the entire 426 bands, that full reflectance curve, we do ratios of bands of interest that help us more succinctly define different information that we want to pull out of that reflectance curve, normally related to the health of the vegetation or different water conditions. And then the L3 products is just the L2 products, as well as some additional LiDAR products that we put into Mosaic. So we deliver those on 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer tiles. When we can, we also collect field ASD spectra, and so we'll go out with a handheld spectrometer. We'll collect samples of leaves as well as calibration tarps. This is sort of additional information to help validate, calibrate, and characterize the airborne imaging spectrometer measurements. And then, as Kate mentioned, we also use the Airborne Observation Platform as one of our assignable assets. This was the first year that we really implemented this program with the AOP, and we collected 3 different assignable asset projects with the AOP this year.
All right, thank you. My name is Christine Laney, and I've been with NEON since the first couple days of 2015. I started out in ecology and evolution, and then I got to working with the Long-Term Ecological Research Network on a synthesis project where we're looking at, can we synthesize all of the long-term ecological data from LTER, and it turned out to be quite painful. And the reason is because all the data were collected differently in different formats on different web pages, documented differently, and it was quite a big project and a big eye-opener. Sometime in the mid-2000s, there was a paper by the National Ecological the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, and they basically estimated that over 90%, probably 95% of ecological data were being lost because it just simply was sitting around in desks and on individual hard drives and so forth. So I got really fascinated by this problem, and so I'm really happy to be here today with NEON, working on making data accessible, making sure that we don't lose it and that people can use it. So I'm going to pop out of our slideshow here into, hopefully, our data portal. And this is actually our general NEON portal. It's neonscience.org. And just before we go to the data portal, I just wanted to show this because we actually provide a lot of useful information about NEON, the observatory, about the different programs that we've been explaining today, about how different data are collected at the observatory. We have a field sites map and list that shows where all of our data are being collected across the United States, including specific site maps that show our various plots and boundaries. It has information about data. We have spatial data and maps, different resources. So code resources. We have an active GitHub repository or GitHub collection where we make mostly R code, some Python, and some other code from AOP available to the public, and we're rapidly building on that. We also provide teaching modules and workshops. The idea is that we could just put all the data on an FTP site, for example, right? And there it is, there's our data. But it's not truly usable, it's not truly accessible until we also reach out to the community and help them use this really wide swath of data that we're collecting. So community, we also have advisory groups that are ongoing. This is a really great resource to check out if you're interested in participating at some point in time. And we have a community forum. And then just also learning opportunities and career opportunities. So I'm going to go back basically to the home page here, and we have a data portal that lives a little separately from our main website here. And this data portal was developed, actually most of it, or a lot of it was developed before we had a lot of data. So we've been doing a lot of iterative work, kind of discovering what are our data going to look like across all these subsystems, what are the challenges associated with delivering them, what are the challenges with documenting them, and so forth. And we're getting to this point where we're starting to have a more mature data portal, but we are going to be changing some of the look and feel over the next year, as well as some of the functionality. So this is the home page of our data portal. There's a few different resources, how to use the data portal, some information about our data quality processes, and also some news. So the news I update every couple weeks or so and just say, hey, here are the new data that we've produced over the last couple weeks, or here are some problems that we've run into, or here are some solutions we've come up with on delivering data, so forth. So this data, this is a search bar that you can just basically type in any data. Anyone have any data of interest? Okay. So soil CO2, or mosquito sample from CO2 traps, carbon dioxide. Anyway, so I chose one, and this is basically showing for every, basically it says, okay, I have these 3 data products, and I'm going to show you all of the sites that we have these data products for, and the date ranges. So this is basically showing that data started back in 2015 for these data products, or at least for the dissolved gases and surface water, and so forth. You can, once you select your data product, you can make some changes on this left bar as to which sites you want to download and what date ranges exactly. And then go ahead, read a little bit more about the data product, and then download it. So it's just really open and accessible. One thing that Mike touched on a little bit is that we don't actually have all of our data available directly through this data portal. So we want to really work closely with our community partners. So for example, our PhenoCam data, our PhenoCam images are on the PhenoCam gallery, but our data portal provides links. So basically, if you're looking for PhenoCam products, you can go to our data portal, look up the site you're interested in, and then we've provided a link out to that. We do the same thing with our genomic data. So we work with Barcode of Life, and we also work with MGRAST, and provide links out to those portals. We're trying to, hopefully we'll do the same with Ameriflux at some point in the near future. So we're trying to make sure that we are more like a piece of this ecosystem of data among the different networks. The other part, one thing to look at, this is just a link that's kind of hiding on this data browse page, but this is a look at kind of what we're working toward on improving data discoverability. So this is a catalog of all of our data products, and this is a graph that shows basically the blue boxes are months of data that are available by site by month. So if you can imagine 2D wind speeds available at Abbey from basically April of 2016 through this last month without any gaps. So this is a nice way to just explore what's available, what you can download. So we'll be working on that. This also provides a time series viewing tool. This is just showing all of the different parameters at once, and then you can drill down to one or more parameters at a time, or you can choose, let's see if this one has 3 different levels on the tower, so you can start doing a little bit of exploration of the data before you download it. All right. We also have landing pages for each of our data products. These have a little bit more information about the data products, how we collect the data, and also links to our documentation. This is pretty basic right now. We are only showing these document numbers, but basically these are usually protocols or algorithm-based, theoretical basis documents, science designs, and other kinds of documents, so it's easily available. And then finally, there's a lot of different resources here, and I'm happy to talk with you after about what's available. We do have our own Contact Us button, and this actually is a very simple form that basically just says, what kind of question do you have, what data product are you working with, and then submit it. But this actually goes into a really very well-curated system that we have to answer questions. So you can put questions about data products you're working with. If you have any questions about tutorials you're looking for, you can put them here. If you are working with the data set and you say, hey, the data look a little weird here, this is a place where you can put that information. Or if you have any suggestions about data portal improvement, you can put them in here. It'll generally get routed to the right person or group who can respond to that. And finally, we do provide programmatic access to our data through an API. And this has been really successful. Last month we had over 1 million hits, or actually a little under 1 million hits, but we had over 12 million data file downloads. So it's rapidly getting popular. We have a lot of different endpoints that you can use and documentation on how to use these different endpoints in your programs. So with that, I think that's about all I have. So thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. We have plenty of time for questions. So let me know and I'll hand you the mic. Oh, did you want to?
Cindy's for us.
Yeah, there you go.
More time on the stage.
Why not?
I got a couple questions. This is mostly on the software side rather than the science. One, do you have you published or is it available, like the source code for all the data recording? How is all that done? If you can explain some of the pipelines there. And related to that, this data portal, is this data real time, meaning like 4 or 5 minutes later after it's been recorded, it shows up here, or someone have to manually do something to get it to the portal?
So I didn't catch the very first part of your data pipeline question, but we do have some brand new videos on YouTube about our data processing pipelines. The data are not real time. There's lags for various reasons to ensure data quality and also to ensure that we have all of the data back from external labs and so forth. And I think these three can speak specifically to the subsystems, but there are lags, different reasons for the lags among the subsystems.
But so I guess the question is, on the QC side, is someone looking at that, or is that mostly machine operated and you're looking at reports?
Right. So the answer is going to vary with our different types of data. For the observational data, we are using an off-the-shelf mobile data entry application. It's a platform called Fulcrum. And so we create these custom forms for each of our data products that provide some front-end quality control. And then our cyber infrastructure essentially is set up to it has the observational data products go through a very generic pipeline that are defined by essentially spreadsheets that define all the definitional data and then all the rules that the cyber infrastructure system then checks, does another round of data quality checks essentially on the inputs coming in. And then those data then are published on the portal. We haven't published our, all of our code for Fulcrum. It's basically a JavaScript application, but again, it's also an off-the-shelf, so there's only so much we can publish. And then in terms of the instrumented systems are more of an automated system, so basically all the data are sent back to headquarters. And there's varying latency in that depending on what kind of service we have out at a site. There are a very few sites where you actually have to physically go and retrieve the data, but that's the minority. But then there's a whole processing pipeline, and all of those algorithms. So we have as Christine mentioned, the algorithm theoretical basis documents, which sort of describes the processing algorithms. But in terms of the Java code that underlies the most of the data processing, that's not published yet. But it's certainly in the plans to be published. We're mostly focusing right now on actually getting all of our data out there. So one of the things I failed to mention was sort of where we are in the evolution of NEON. And we are basically finishing construction of the observatory this month. So we started it and building it in 2012. So it's been a long time. And so we've been operational at many sites, which is why you see, for many years, which is why you see data from 2013. But we're really just finishing construction and moving into our operational phase. And then Tristan can speak more to the airborne data. But our instrumented data, which is generally what people expect to be real time, was not designed to be delivered on a real-time basis. And so it would require some substantial modification at this point in order to do that.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not asking for demanding that. I'm just trying to understand your data flow. How do you go
Sure.
from measuring some temperature and kind of related to this is how do you handle calibrations? Because I'm sure just about every instrument has some sort of calibration attached to it. So how do you take the calibration plus the raw sample, you somehow merge those together to get a real value, and from that you start pushing it down into the QC pipelines, and that sounds like you've got several different application sets that do that.
Yeah, so we get the raw data, whether it be like ohms or volts or whatever in the field, and then the calibration coefficient is applied along with the ATBD, which transfers it to a level 1 data product. And then in that processing, there are a number of automated flags and QA/QC tests that are applied. So whether they be thresholds or consistency checks between levels in the tower, et cetera, et cetera. So that varies in the data product. And then flags are applied, and then we will take a look and investigate flag data, and then just bring it to the portal. Does that make sense? Yep. So we could remove a flag or add a flag if
Airborne data is not real time. But seriously, I mean, it's like, there's several manual steps with airborne data that we're never going to get rid of. Removing the drives from the airplane, installing them into a computer where we do field checks on the data, and then they're shipped via FedEx back to our headquarters, and then the data gets ingested, and then we pull it down and do some processing, and then push the products up. And normally, we can, from the last day of flight of a site until a data product is on the portal is a month and a half kind of time frame.
I have a couple of questions. The first question is, do you plan to be making the same measurements 5-10 years down the road that you're making now?
Yes, I should have mentioned that. The plan for NEON is to operate for 30 years. And the clock on that, I believe, starts next year. So.
Right, but will you expect to be using the same sensors 10 years from now than you're using now?
No, I mean, we're going to need to adapt to the changing landscape and technological advances. And so we're currently developing plans on sort of how to do that so that the data are comparable through time. But we do expect quite a bit of evolution in the sensor sets.
You don't expect to add any new data as discoveries are made to go, oh gosh, if we were only measuring, I don't know, mosquito wing color or something.
Right. We certainly hope that is the reality for NEON. I think right now, since we're just getting started, it's a more challenging argument for us to make to the NSF to invest in some additional measurements. But that certainly, we as the scientists at NEON are very optimistic that is going to be the case, and that will be driven largely by community demand and use of our data, and then saying we need this as well. So,
and the other question about your data is, so there's things like, how do you handle missing data, and are you using similar kind of formats for ASCII or NetCDF, or do you have common formats? And how do you handle things? Missing data is always kind of an issue. How do you flag it and do that sort of thing?
So the missing data, it's all part of at least for the instrumented systems, it's all part of the automated processing pipeline that the algorithm for each data product determines what various conditions result in certain flags, fields essentially being converted from a 0 to a 1. And missing data is one of the conditions that is checked for in those to then report that. So that you have the stream of information, but then there's flags to indicate that it's missing.
And presumably there's some human intervention in some of this too. So somebody looks over some of the data and goes, whoops, this didn't work or something.
Absolutely, yeah. So we're still developing a lot of our tools for all of the data products to better automate some of that, even the human intervention parts of it. But yes, there's definitely flag review that goes on and ability to update data.
And most of your data ASCII then?
So most of our data is in CSV, and then we also serve some data in HDF5, so NetCDF.
And then the AOP formats.
Oh yeah, I don't know what your formats are.
None of our data is in CSV. No, I mean, it's general image file, GeoTIFFs, and then we did design our own HDF5 format for our reflectance data. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I have a couple of questions. Ever since I learned this term peak greenness, I love it. And I'm using it as if I do know something about ecology. But I'm fascinated by the fact that you have to map these regions and you have to move fairly quickly. And you say the weather can be sometimes in our way. And my question is purely operational. How do you handle, do you have friends, weather forecasters, who tell you, avoid here, avoid there? So that's a purely operational question. The other one is regarding your mobile platforms. How do researchers request your mobile systems to get them to the field to do whatever they want?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's a difficult, challenging problem to deal with because of those peak greenness schedules. We identify a time period that we're going to be at a site each year in order to kind of make sure that when we leave one site, we're going to be able to get to the next site within its peak greenness schedule. So there's limited ability for us to dynamically adjust our schedule during the year. So we rely on luck for the weather because we are going to be in a place. Yeah. So generally we know we've done historical analysis that give us information on the length of time we may need to be in a site in order to collect cloud-free data. And sometimes we're able to stay for that length of time and sometimes we're not, which is where the luck comes into it. But yeah, it's a tough problem to solve, especially, like I mentioned, a place like Great Smoky Mountains, as well as, Alaska is particularly challenging for us. Our analysis there showed us that we needed to have about 30 scheduled days per single good collection day in Alaska. So, it would take us 6 or 8 days to fly all of our sites there, but we're not going to be there for 180 days.
So for the mobile platforms, and this is a similar process for if you want to just put another instrument on our tower, there is on the web page a link to the Assignable Assets page, which gives some information on the process and what the mobile platforms are, and then you can link into a form where you're basically submitting a request, whether it be to put an instrument on the tower, and it gives you guidelines on the information we need. And then I think what's very similar to your OFAP panel, we have an internal feasibility review where we will work with internally to determine do we have the power supply for that instrument? Can our boom hold that instrument, et cetera? Or can the mobile platform be deployed there? Is there limitations? And then we will come back with a cost estimate if there was one so that you can write it into a proposal or and a yes or no on the feasibility assessment. And so that's when we're meeting, we're meeting kind of as they come up right now to get people in quickly, which has been good. We've got quite a few Assignable Asset requests as far as putting instruments on the towers. They're starting to come along, which is nice.
All right, we'll have one last question from Steve.
Just a quick one on the Airborne platform. I noticed that Platform 1 was not used in the latest year. So is that like back being refurbished or something and be put back in the pool?
Yeah, actually, in this particular year, we used that Platform 1 for one of our assignable asset flights. And so normally what we'll be doing is 2 of the platforms will be used to collect the NEON sites, and then the other one will be reserved for the assignable asset collections.
I thought I heard at one point that one of them was going to be like permanently in Hawaii or something because it was hard to move back and forth.
Yeah, no. So Hawaii is a particularly challenging site for us, and we're currently actually working on a plan to outsource the collection of Hawaii.
So I think we'll stop there, but I'll ask their speakers to stick around for a few minutes for people to walk up with pressing questions. And please join me in thanking all of our speakers.